Today marks the third anniversary since the killing of Babita Deokaran, who was a senior official in the Gauteng Health Department. Deokaran was instrumental in uncovering massive alleged corruption within the department, specifically linked to irregularities at Tembisa Hospital. The whistleblower came under a hail of bullets in her driveway after dropping off her daughter at school. Although 6 men were sentenced last year to prison terms ranging from 6 to 22 years, the masterminds behind this alleged crime, are still at large, leaving, of course, many unanswered questions. Let's make sense of the sobering anniversary. Bring in SABC News reporter Hasina Gori, who's with us here in studio and has been watching the story closely. Joining us via our video link is EXCO member from Active Citizen Movement, that's Advocate Babita Deokaran, who also provide insights, I suppose, into challenges faced by whistleblowers. To both our speakers, a colleague and a guest, it's great to have you. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Hasina, let me begin with you in studio. 3 years, certainly nothing to be scoffed at. Yes, there's been some movement, but of course, still so many unanswered questions, as I mentioned. Perhaps help us rehash some of the details around what Babita Deokaran was looking into and what ultimately happened.
As you've mentioned, she was an instrumental part in the SIU's investigation to irregularities within the Gauteng Health Department, but specifically Tembisa Hospital. When it came to PPE during the COVID-19 era, that specific hospital, there were tenders between suppliers and services ranging to almost 850 million rand, almost R1 million that was going into very irregular, misadministrated, and she raised alarms. She worked with the SIU, gave information, gave some of the insights, also her warnings that she had given to Gauteng Health Department on these tenders were completely ignored, and they went ahead with them. I remember there were claims of jeans that were being procured at that time for weird amounts of monies.
Yeah, skinny jeans in a hospital.
Yes, during COVID-19,
right,
which doesn't even fall within a PPE, a list that they would need. And she brought these under, investigation. She worked with the SIU quite closely. And when her death happened, it really brought around the issues of corruption that we have within the country, maladministration, but also that whistleblowers do not have protection. They either disappear, they lose their jobs, they become under investigation, or they lose their life, as we saw with Babita Deokaran. So this investigation began that first process last year when, as you mentioned, the 6 men who were arrested quite swiftly. We can give the Hawks, the police, they did work quite swiftly in ensuring that those 6 men were found and brought in. But from the onset, those 6 completely stood by their innocence, saying that they were first coerced into giving their testimony, saying that they were being abused. One even fingered then Health Minister Zweli Mkhize, saying that he was the mastermind behind this entire orchestra that happened. We saw responses from Mkhize at that time saying that he will have his day in court should the matter go to that stage, but he denied any involvement or even knowing Babita Deokaran. These 6 men were given a plea agreement last year on the eve of her 2nd anniversary, but it was given in exchange for the masterminds being brought to book. We have not seen that as yet. When it comes to the investigation of the SIU last year, on the eve as well, in their statement, they said that at least 6 of the 9 officials that were named in their report had been suspended, others had left their jobs, but we haven't seen anyone really being held accountable, anyone being brought to book. Police investigations completely mum at this stage. So while 6 men are behind the bars, they're just the people that were paid in an alleged hit. At this stage, they pulled the trigger, but they're not exactly the person or those that were responsible for her death.
It feels like we are yet to touch the tip of the iceberg insofar as this network is concerned. At least that's what emerged. Advocate Adila, perhaps I can bring you into the discussion. What was also really chilling around Babita Deokaran's story is the WhatsApp messages she had sent to some of her seniors where she said, look, I'm really worried that people are going to start picking up that we're onto them and that our lives may be at risk. It's so disheartening in some instance that even though she had a sense that her life was in danger, that wasn't enough to protect her.
That is 100% correct. There isn't sufficient mechanisms in place, and even from a legal perspective, the legislation, to protect whistleblowers. We don't have a safety house. We don't have financial support for whistleblowers. And what is even worse is that the psychological impact it has on whistleblowers, the anxiety, the depression, and obviously we have to look at the fact that some of our whistleblowers, like Babita Deokaran, paid the ultimate price with her life.
Absolutely. And, the president has spoken about protecting whistleblowers in some of his speeches. We have seen protests, some activists really speaking out. Whistleblowers who are in exile, if you like, have also given a number of media interviews. I wonder to what extent you reckon there's been a heightened awareness of the ways in which whistleblowers continue to be exposed, despite just how important their contribution is.
Whistleblowers play a major part in society in terms of exposing corruption, whether it's in private, public sectors. But unfortunately, I do not believe there is sufficient awareness of the whistleblowers, their rights, and sufficient mechanism even within legislation to protect whistleblowers. I mean, for example, you have certain sections have been implemented or improved in legislation, like Section 188A, it's subsection 11 of the Labor Relations Act, which when an employer wants to discipline an employee, they can approach the CCMA and ask for their disciplinary to be looked under that specific section, which classifies them as a whistleblower. But when they do approach the CCMA, the employer is running a parallel process for their dismissal and their investigation. And what then transpires is before the CCMA has classified them as a whistleblower and the matter to be considered under the specific section, they're dismissed. So there's loopholes in the system that make it very difficult to protect whistleblowers.
Absolutely. Hasina, let's bring you back into the discussion. I mean, some of the details around what this money was allegedly being used for was really jaw-dropping, for lack of a better term. I mean, you and I spoke about the skinny jeans, for example, but buckets were being bought for about 10,000 rand. This was really deep-rooted, kind of brazen corruption that Babita was trying to flag.
And I think that this is something that is systematic, not just within the Gauteng Health Department as a whole, but we saw during state capture as well, and the corruption that we've seen in many different public entities within the country, showing that, because there's been this lackluster of any accountability or anyone really being brought to the book, that people have been getting away with these kind of corruptions and maladministration and fraudulent activities with funds that were meant to help the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable. And, there's mechanisms that are meant to be put into place in these tender processes to ensure that everything is done in the most equitable and in the most just way. But there have been consistent lack of any of these terms being put into place. And then when you have whistleblowers coming out, when people that are coming and flagging these, they either taken to their own disciplinary hearings, they either removed from their jobs, or they find that they become a target as well. And I think that Babita Deokaran's case in this specific one just highlights the deep-rooted rot of corruption within a society as a whole, whether it's in our public entities, but also in private entities. And that we saw it not just within this case, but also with the PPEs. We saw it with senior officials being suspended just at the height of COVID-19. We saw it with the digital vibes, issue. Also within the health department, that there was so much corruption that just happened within that period of COVID-19. And still till today, no one again being held accountable, no one paying a price, no one being made even an example of. But we see people like Babita Deokaran paying the price with their life. And I think that at some point, we need to see justice being brought and more outrage, and more force being brought to these public officials and government to hold people accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that corruption does have an effect on the poor. It's not a, effective-less crime, so to speak. And Advocate Adila, I suppose what always comes up when we think about what happened to Babita Deokaran is the very clear chilling effect that will emerge from what happened. If there are people, even in the Gauteng Health Department, who have information, I'm sure for many of them, there's a lot to be considered, even if they wanted to speak out.
No, that is true, because if those perpetrators 3 years later have not been held accountable, it sends a very bad message to people that who would want to testify in her, in her interest to make sure justice is served. But they would be very, very skeptical. And that also sends at large a very bad signal to whistleblowers, because it's almost saying, blow the whistle and you will pay the price of with your life. And there is no mechanism for justice ultimately.
Yeah. What I was really taken aback by, Hasina, is the comparison between Tembisa Hospital and Charlotte Maxeke. I mean, when you think about the sheer size of the institutions, Charlotte Maxeke is, I think, 4 times larger than Tembisa. But the money that Tembisa was spending on these procurement processes far outpaced the money that Charlotte Maxeke had to spend. So this felt really concerted and targeted.
Yes, it felt like they saw a loophole,
Right.
They saw a space that they could then exploit and make money out of. We know that in certain of these hospitals, they need for an upgrade maybe, or there was justifiable reason why money was meant to be spent in that specific hospital to bring it up to standard of maybe Charlotte Maxeke, to bring more services in. However, that money was then deviated from where it was needed to be given to help and assist. We have a healthcare issue within Gauteng, within the country as a whole, but in Gauteng, we have healthcare issues. We have a public health service that needs money to be put in, to be used. So I don't think that the budget was not allocated for good or for use that was needed. It was just then redirected, and people then used it for their own personal gain, for their own greed, and again, we left in a state where Tembisa Hospital is not at the state where it needs to be at to assist the poor and vulnerable in that area. We have, a backlog of just surgeries and, people that need assistance within Gauteng Health Department. We know that there have been efforts to, ensure everyone gets healthcare. There's money that's meant to be allocated to be spent there. And I think that number of money and the budget that was given to them was for a reason.
Yeah.
But then it was then reused completely, for people's personal gain. We talked about the buckets, the skinny jeans, all the other procurements that they put into place. And now that money gone, never recovered. Even though the SIU has mentioned that some of the monies were able to be saved, it still doesn't assist the poorest of the poor. And we left in a situation where our healthcare system gets worse. There's no money now to actually, go and bring those services in, and no one again that will be able to be held accountable. And as the advocate mentioned, even if people want to come out and say there is issues happening here, there's irregularities, I'm seeing this mismanagement, or we're seeing invoices going into specific spaces, they are now skeptical, scared, or completely just disingenuous of it and saying, well, this is the process. Maybe I should just then benefit as well, which is also what we see happening, is that people that want to do good, that want to assist, feeling that it has no purpose, and maybe I should also then just benefit from the corruption that is there. And we left in a cycle that just leaves us completely in this corrupt and horrible loop.
Yeah, it certainly is disheartening. Advocate Adila, as we round off our discussion, yes, 6 men have been arrested. We know that these are the people who, orchestrated the pulling of the trigger, so to speak. But a question which I always find is difficult to ask and perhaps even harder to answer is Babita Deokaran's death in vain?
I hope it doesn't come to that, because that would be devastating on the family, and if for a country that has such exposure to fraud and corruption. During the COVID period, we borrowed money to keep the country afloat, and we are heavily indebted. And to think Babita stood for a principle and she paid the price with her life, and for that to have been in vain would be a serious breakdown in our legal system.
Absolutely. Hopefully it doesn't get to that. Let me thank you both for your time. It's an important discussion to have, not only on the anniversary of her death, but hopefully throughout the years until there is some kind of accountability. Advocate Adila Cohen, thank you very much for speaking to us. She's the executive member of an organization called Active Citizen Movement. And joining us here in studio is our Hasina Gori. Always a pleasure. To both of you, once again, we appreciate the time.